Hello everyone. My name's John Conley. We met in the first week, and I'm going to say some things about development and health policy, with a particular focus on managerial and institutional issues. So this relatively brief talk will give you some insights into some of the key ideas around understanding change and understanding the nature of managerialism in the public sector, but mainly focused on health policy. Okay, I'll just move my slides along. Okay, as an overview, so key ideas for understanding change, and we'll focus on the rise of managerialism. And as we do that, we'll talk about some of the developments and ideas around how you manage the public sector. Mainly the rise of new public management thinking, which has endured quite significantly, although we will be talking as well about the potential successor to new public management, which is what we call public value management. So we'll give you an interpretation, an insight into the ways in which we can think about health policy from the perspective of institutional change. Okay, so when we talk about health policy, a lot of the times we have to talk about actors. We have to talk about the context of in which health policy takes place, and one of those is to understand who's involved. And health policy isn't just about health-focused civil servants, or directors for public health, or ministers for public health. It can involve a range of actors. But one of the things that I'd like to just say from the outset is policy actors can be varied and tend to be individuals and organisations that have an interest in a policy. So Nell and Tucson define policy actors, as individuals, groups and organisations who have an interest in and are involved in the policy process. Examples of those could be institutions of representation, so it could be the legislature, it could be parliamentarians. Political parties are often interested in health policy. There could be groups which involve pressure groups, which could be groups such as patient representative organisations. Other interest groups as well that might have some interest in the general well-being of a country and individuals. Government departments, so the Department for Health, for instance, at UK level would be a good example of a health department. Regulatory institutions could involve institutions and agencies that look after and enforce health policy, and it might be quite broad. So, for instance, in the UK level, we have the Health Security Agency that used to be Public Health England. In Scotland, we have Health Protection Scotland. We've got Public Health Scotland. There's a range of different organisations that have a policy and regulative function, but also it might also involve organisations that you might not first think of when you first think of health. Actually, perhaps health could be in the title when thinking about those types of organisations. So think about, for instance, the Health and Safety Executive. Think about their role in terms of health in the workplace and in environments whereby there needs to be an enforced rules about how organisations conduct themselves. Hospitals, trusts and agencies as well. Of course, these are good examples of policy actors in the health space. What about supranational or intergovernmental institutions and bodies? The World Health Organization comes to mind. What about industry? The pharmaceutical industry often tries to influence policy and are influenced by policy as well through the regulation of medicines and so on. Think about experts. Could be independent scientists or academics, or those that have institutional knowledge, and institutionalized knowledge brokers, if you like, technocrats. So when we talk about technocrats as opposed to bureaucrats, technocrats are essentially bureaucrats that have expertise in a particular area. So, for instance, Within Scottish Government's Health Department, I've met several civil servants who are actually medics. So you might have civil servants who, you know, if they had a general background, they might be known as bureaucrats or officials. But in some areas like health, with a technical dimension to them, often you have individuals that have specific expertise in an area. So they would be regarded as technocrats. Strictly speaking, they're employed as civil servants, but they're employed as civil servants because of their expertise. So this slide just gives you some examples of actors in the health policy space. And so when you hear people talking about policy actors in health, these are examples of those. There are more, but these are the key actors, if you like. I think it's important to recognise that policy actors exist within an environment. And when we think about policy actors, we can think about policy actors in terms of being part of a system. Systems-based thinking is something that's become more popular within the policy literature, including within health policy. You'll see a lot of journal articles and even journal titles and books written about health systems across the world. And what they're really trying to do is to tell you that in a system, there's a lot of interlocking parts. So when you think about health policy, it's important to think about the context and the interlocking parts that shape a health system and who's part of it. This is a representation, if you like, of a policy system which can be adapted to different types of policies. So on the one hand, you've got the entire visual, if you like, represents a policy universe, and that at the outer core is made up of the international policy space. So it could be, include the WHO. It can involve a number of different international bodies. You've got broader society, and you've got the state as well. Society is shaped by health policy, and also the state helps to create health policy. Within the network, if you like, or within that core, is something called a policy subsystem, where you've got a wider discourse community, which can be made up of those that generate the narratives about how health policy should be and what health policies we should have. And there's an interest network in the core of it as well, which can be made up of a number of different actors, which we'll look at in a moment. So if you look at this diagram and we apply it to health policy, you can see how different actors can slot in to that process. I'm just waiting for my slides to move along. Yep. So let's just take the example of UK health security, right? So health security, what is it? Health security is policies that try and protect us from health threats, issues like a pandemic. It could be pandemic the coronavirus, it could be pandemic flu, it can be wider conditions that shape our health. So for instance, Ebola is an example of a health security problem. The pandemic COVID-19 is another. So if we were to think about that policy space of health security, who are the key actors that would slot into the policy system? Well, you can see at an international level can involve the WHO, the UN, European Commission, the OIE, which is the WHO equivalent, if you like, of animal health. And it's relevant for this area because animal health disease can transmit to human health disease, and therefore that can cause a problem for health policy and requires a response by health actors. International trade bodies can have an impact on our health depending on the products that we consume. It can have an impact on a range of issues. Trade policy can impact on health inequalities and so on. Society, in that circle, you can see there's the public, there's communities, there's wider services. The other side, you've got the state. Again, that's made up of the institutions or organisations of the state, which can include the NHS, the Department for Health, other agencies, and so on, including the legislature. Inside, the policy subsystem can include the wider discourse community, which include the political parties that might be talking about health policy and raising awareness of health policy. It can involve the media. It can involve other interest groups as well. Within the interest network at the core, that can involve specific actors that are really key network actors for how health security policy is executed and implemented. So that could be vaccine providers, it could be the hospitality industry that have a role in obviously making sure that diseases don't spread. We've seen how the lockdowns have an impact on that part of the industry. Sports, schools, NHS Confederation, which is the representative body of NHS providers. So these groups in the middle here have a key interest in the policy in terms of not just social implications, but also economic implications as well. But the key thing to remember is that these actors exist within this policy universe. But within that universe is a subsystem whereby they've got to work together. So you'll notice that the circles on the screen are interlocking, they overlap. And that's to demonstrate that within a system, there are overlapping responsibilities, there's overlapping actors that have to cooperate, coordinate. And I think that's important for when we study health policy, because health policy has to be considered from an interconnected perspective. We're not just thinking about it in isolation or a vacuum. So whatever policy of health or any wider policy you choose, think about it using this framework, because it helps us to map out who the key stakeholders are, how they're interrelated, and it gives us a broad picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about health policy. The key message here, therefore, is if we're thinking about developments in health policy, one of the key developments from an academic perspective, and actually a policy and applied perspective, is the rise of systems-based thinking, systems-based ideas, the idea that within a system, there are component parts which are interrelated with each other. So policy systems is metaphorical in a sense. It's a diagrammatic representation of what we're talking about when we're talking about the complexity of health policy. But let's take it one step further. Let's just say, well, if I was going to study health policy, what are the key conceptual ways can I use to understand health policy? An example would be an institutionalist approach. So, for instance, this concerns the role of institutions and refers to the regular patterns of behaviours, rules, norms and practices and relationships that influence behaviour. So an example of that would be if, for instance, you are working within a health agency, if you were an employee in a health agency, that agency, the rules, norms within that agency shapes how you do policy making. It shapes how you approach your work. It shapes the rules of the game, if you like, how you interact with your colleagues, how you interact with external organizations. So it's really about how institutions themselves shape behaviors. So institutions are not just about the physical structure of a building that you can point to. It is the rules, informal, procedures, norms, traditions and cultures that influence policy making and change. So the argument would be that institutions contextualize the shape, manner and culture of how policies are created and how they are implemented. A couple of references here on the slide, Kearney, Judge. Every reference that I talk about in this talk, I've provided a final slide later, which gives you all the references so you can follow up yourselves and do some reading, in addition to the reading that I'll give you via the Moodle site as well. However, one of the things, at your stage in your learning, you'll know that some theories or some conceptual approaches have variants to them. They have subsets to them. So institutionalism is that broad idea about how institutions matter for policy making. But actually, if we dig a little bit deeper, there are variants of institutionalism. So one is historical institutionalism. And this is very relevant to the seminar, the live discussion we're going to have, because that's really going to be an element of the focus, which is historical institutionalism highlights the importance of path dependence. So the idea that events and decisions in the past influence current practices. As Balazs and Williams say, path dependence exists when the outcome of a process depends on its past history, on a sequence of decisions made by agencies and resulting outcomes, and not only on contemporary conditions. So the idea is that the change that emerges is dictated by what comes before. So when you're looking at health policy, one question you should be thinking is, when a government introduces a new health policy, does it just refine what was there before? How radical is it? Is it really a significant reform? Or is it that the funding landscape, the ideologies, the policies that of the past, have they really shaped what comes in the future? A lot of public policy writings suggest that path dependence is very important in terms of the fact that institutions themselves can change very gradually. And if the idea is that institutions shape policy, therefore, gradual and predetermined events can shape policy, right? So it's quite conservative in a way. I mean conservative not in terms of the political party. I mean it in terms of sluggish change, more slower or gradual adjustment to conditions. Conservatism with a small c, if you like. So the idea here is that path dependence only is really subject to a critical juncture or destabilization when there's a crisis of some type or a major external change to the policy area. So it could be things like, a credit crunch, a pandemic. It could be a change of government at a general election. Those types of things that can redefine the path, if you like, of a policy. Under normal circumstances, though, the idea is that the past influences the future. So that's key. Rational choice ideas is based on the perspective that individuals are utility maximizers within institutions, and that basically individuals that exist within institutions can navigate organizations, and that they know that actions have different consequences in different contexts, and that's how they pursue their interests. So it's a calculated approach to change in a way. So individuals are quite ambitious in some ways. They know the rules of the game and how to exploit them. So in many ways, that rational choice perspective is about how individuals maximize their influence within institutions and also within the policymaking process. More sociological interpretations of institutionalism highlight the fact that institutions give us perspective, which is more socially driven. So that it's based on the idea that institutions provide meaning to social life. Institutions are cultural entities and socially constructed. Hall and Taylor talk about the individual action is socially constituted by and through institutions. So institutions are important from a social perspective. So it's more of a sociological underpinning here. There's normative interpretations as well. Emphasis is placed upon norms rather than organizational forms. So normative means that we do things because it's habitual. It's just part of the norms of our organization. We dress a certain way. We speak to each other using a certain form of language. We conduct ourselves in such a way that is dictated by the organization or institution itself. And that's from March and Olson. There are critiques of this, though. The emphasis on institutions is quite top down, the idea that the rules of the game are dictated by the organisation and its culture. Does that underplay the role of policy actors who try to implement change from the bottom up and perhaps don't always conform to the institution? It's not really that great at capturing and explaining radical political change. It does talk about critical junctures and the idea of what they call punctuating the equilibrium through crises and big change, but it's not so great at perhaps documenting the radical and even less radical changes that can happen. There are particular points of critique that can be directed at variants of new institutionalism. For instance, for the rational choice interpretation, for instance, are all individuals utility maximizers? Is that really the case? Or are people and organizations there to work for the collective good? Is everyone that ambitious? It's a big question. Rules and norms are fundamental to the institutional life, according to institutionalist approaches. However, does everyone in institutions interpret rules in the same way? Can we all say that we're all the same in that regard? It's open to interpretation. Again, on the other side of the coin is that there's something called the rational model of policy making. And the rational model is often put out there as the counter to incrementalist approaches. And I guess it's the ideal type model if you're looking to take a very evidence-based, calculated, meticulous approach to doing policy. It's very rational in that you try and weigh up the costs and benefits of doing policy in a certain way. There's certain steps you go through here. So a policymaker, for instance, if they're a health policymaker, by taking a rational approach, would define and rank his or her governing values. What is it they're hoping to achieve? So is it to reduce health inequalities? Then they would specify compatible objectives with these values. So do we invest in a certain program? Do we invest in something else? Do we introduce a new initiative? Do we roll out a health promotion campaign? A number of different objectives could be there. But then, associated with those objectives, you'd have to also look at the accompanying options to those in terms of how to achieve these objectives. So that would be a very meticulous process. And then you would calculate all the consequences of those options and then compare them in terms of the pros and cons. And then finally, you would choose the option or combination of options which would maximize the original values you stated at point one. So again, quite a laborious process. It is a fairly robust process, but do the realities of the policymaking life allow for that? So critiques of the rational model could be that it's quite impractical in the real world of policymaking, which can be fast-paced and engulfed by uncertainty and risk for this type of thing to happen. Rational models kind of suggest that we have perfect knowledge. Do we have perfect knowledge to inform policy? For instance, is it really the case that we always have the evidence for something? What about the idea of bounded rationality? Is it the case, for instance, that excuse me, the idea that that we are all subject to a range of constraints, and the principles of a rational model could be treated as ideal to aspire to, and decisions need to be made in terms of what is good enough. So bounded rationality is linked to this idea of satisficing. In other words, you might want to follow elements of the rational model, but you're also able to make a decision more quickly, and that you'll try and be rational to a point. Incrementalism, what we talked about, provides a similar critique of the rational model in terms of the cognitive and problem-solving abilities of policymakers, the resource limitations, and the rational model does not account for the contours or fluidity of political processes. Again, incrementalism is based on the work of Charles Lindblom, and this is another perspective on change, which can be related to health policy. So if you're thinking about health policy from an incrementalist perspective, you would be thinking about how you do policy on an ongoing basis. In many senses, the incrementalist approaches is a response to the criticisms of the rational model. For instance, it's the idea that policy making is more political than technical. What came before in the policy cycle has implications for what comes next, very similar to path dependency. There's not always a clear direction to the policy process. If you think about the analytical preoccupation with remedying problems rather than having positive goals to be sought. So in some ways, this idea of the strategic, to what extent can the rational model in some ways do that? Is it a strategic approach? The recognition that policy making is a process of trial and error. That's what incrementalists would say. Also, incrementalists would say that not all policy options are considered. And to be honest, it's often based on preferences that we see. The options that are put out in front of you. Is it always the case that all options are on the table? Incrementalism emphasizes change from the status quo, but it also says that change is gradual and incremental. One of the things that incrementalists would say is that there's a reciprocal relationship between policy ends and means. Okay, so these are some of the different perspectives that are useful for you in your armory when it comes to thinking about public policy from a conceptual basis. The rationalists and incrementalists are often at each other's necks because they just see the policy world in different ways. But there are other ideas associated with how we view public policy. And we'll do that. We'll come on to that now. I'm trying to move my slides along. Yeah, just 2 seconds. Yeah. Critiques of incrementalism is that there's a lack of goal orientation, inherently conservative, and there's a lack of acknowledgement of large-scale innovation. Can it be undemocratic? That's some of the arguments that have been put forward. That incrementalism is quite elite-driven, and that policymaking is confined to a select group of policymakers. Is it short-sighted due to its lack of strategic vision and the downplaying of systemic analysis? Incrementalism is more suited to stable policy environments. But what about the roles of crisis situations? And we've all seen one recently in terms of the pandemic. There are also structural perspectives as well. So if you think about Marxist interpretations, focuses on elites, the structure of government and decision making is there to preserve the capitalist system of economic production. That's what Marxists would say. The idea that policymakers privilege business interests and that such actors have direct access to the corridors of power. It's also the argument that senior policy roles are taken up by those of a particular class. So your ministers, your senior civil servants within health departments, do they really represent and reflect society? It could be argued that, for instance, the evidence about reducing health inequalities, if you really want to change health inequalities, you have to look at the structural underpinnings of society. You have to redistribute income, and you have to use those mechanisms to do that. Implementing things like health behaviour programs, asking people to eat less and eat more healthily, exercise more, those will have very limited societal population level impacts on reducing health inequalities, because health inequalities is driven by a number of things, including poverty and deprivation. So those with a Marxist interpretation of health policy would say we have to look at the structural underpinnings of society and ensure that policies are implemented which redistribute income and raise those in poverty out of poverty. So that's what the Marxist interpretations would say. I must say that the evidence in terms of reducing health inequalities kind of backs up this narrative about how you would need structural reform to really deal with health inequalities seriously. But there's questions about whether or not the government would be prepared to do that, and indeed whether or not the public would be prepared to do that, particularly if you're looking at taxes and caps on earnings and so on. So those are big questions. That said, though, is it always the case that major macro policies that have an impact on health have not been approached by a kind of, how would you say state interventionist approach that Marxists would call for? Can all policies be seen in the context of preserving the capitalist system, considering post-World War II health policy and the welfare state, for instance? Is there still a class system? Is there more of a meritocracy now in the health service and wider policy areas? These are big questions for you to wrestle with. Other structural perspectives, in addition to Marxist thought, include globalization. Now, globalization has become more of a concept. It is a vague term, but generally refers to the interdependence between states and between states driven by economic liberalization and the changing nature of the world economy. It may also refer to the social and cultural integration as a result of greater interaction between countries and their populations. It illustrates the changing patterns of international and national governments. However, the idea of economic interdependence cannot be seen to be an equally distributed process. For example, think of the costs and benefits of globalization. They're not always equally distributed across the world. It's the less developed states that reap most, it's the developed states that reap most of the benefits of economic interdependence. And it leads to the widening of the gap between rich and poor nations. And this is also with regards to health. Think about the COVID-19 vaccine rollout and the fact that those in the global south have not had the coverage that the north has. And that's a reflection of inequality. And it has a major impact on health. We are only as strong as our weakest link in the world in terms of health governance and health security. And perhaps that's something that policymakers forget to remember sometimes. This term governance is acutely important. It's acutely important for what we'll come on to talk about in terms of managerialism, because governance is really about how the state organises itself. You know, is the state hierarchical? Is it decentralised? Is that the case for the health service? Is it the case that actually the health service has to be governed in a certain way so that the relationship it has with non-state actors, that could be private businesses, it could be the private medical industry, what about the market, what about third sector bodies that have a role, if you like, within health policy? In some ways, governance has a pluralist orientation. So it's the idea you've got all those policy actors that we referred to earlier on in this system, or you could regard them as networks, but they have to be governed, they have to be managed, they have to be led and steered. Okay, so it's important to see governance as something we talk about when we're thinking about how to organise the state, how to organise the public sector. Questions have been raised in the literature in terms of the emphasis on governance. So governance people say that actually the state is just one actor in addition to multiple others. So has the state really been hollowed out? So state, basically the idea is the state's been hollowed out to make room for all these other actors. You know, it could be third sector bodies, it could be the pharmaceuticals, it could be the private healthcare industry and so on. But does this really downplay the role of the centre? In other words, government. Government can change policy. Government can withdraw support for certain actors. It can defund or it can fund. It depends on what the state seeks to do. So maybe there's a little bit of an overemphasis in terms of the lack of power of the state within governance narratives. Does governance itself, you know, if you put that in inverted commas, does it capture too much and therefore weaken explanatory power? Is it just more of a metaphor that describes the dynamics of the policy context rather than being a powerful theoretical approach? Well, what I would say is it's useful for us as students of health policy, and it allows us to think about health policy from a position of organisation of all. So how should it be organised? How should health policy be governed? Who are the actors involved? How can we steer them? How can we ensure that governance happens in a way that's based on good principles, for example, good governance? How can we ensure that governance happens in such a way where there's clear lines of accountability and control? If, for instance, governance breeds a kind of complexity by the fact that you've got all these actors working together, is it the case that if you govern wrongly, the lines of accountability can become quite blurred, and therefore it's possible for those within a system, a policy system, to avoid being blamed for things if things go wrong, because the landscape is just so complex that you can maneuver and try and get out the way of culpability if things go wrong. So governance has its limitations, but it also has its usefulness in capturing the complexity of the policy landscape. Okay, that's part one. That's part one of this talk. I'm going to end this talk now because we've looked at some of the dominant kind of ideas around conceptualizing change, but now we're going to come on to talk more specifically about the managerialist flair and direction of what's happened within the public sector, including within health policy and the NHS, and look at some of the debates around that. So please do join me for part two of this talk, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll join you again soon. Thank you.